Welcome to Witham Sounding Board, a podcast sharing powerful business tips, insights, and trends for those seeking to become a rock star in their industry.
This is Cuddy Thomas with Witham CFO Podcast. I am part of Witham's outsourced accounting and fractional CFO practice line. If you'd like to know more about what we do and how we support our clients, please go to www.witham.com/oasis. That's spelled OASYS. Joining me today is Mike Troiano. Mike is a branding expert, a founding member and LP of G20 Ventures. I was fortunate to have worked with Mike and the folks who have worked with him in the past, or now know him for his unique skill of storytelling. By the way, there's plenty on top of that. Our discussion today will focus on the relationship between finance and go-to-market strategies in high-performing companies and Mike's journey into venture capital. Mike, welcome. How are you?
I am good. It's so good to see you. I'm thrilled to be here. And I love this topic because I think it doesn't get enough attention. And it's one of the reasons I'm such a huge fan of yours and everybody that was part of that organization at Actifio, which is the place where we work together, I think really understood this in both the Pierce administration and the Kelleher administration. I'm thrilled to be here and spend this time.
Wonderful. Yeah, Actifio will have a special place in my heart and all the people that I worked with. So I'm glad we're able to continue this relationship. Let's talk about the relationship between finance and GTM or go-to-market in high-performing companies. Obviously, a lot of people look at finance and go-to-market as operating in silos. In your experience, how can these teams collaborate to drive growth?
I think the short answer is by understanding each other and the way that they, at the end of the day, have the same incentives, which is to, work toward profitable growth of the business, right? What united us was our ability to think like shareholders and not like department leaders. And I think where people get into trouble is this is like almost a cliche. The sales guys want everything. They want to, invite all these customers and prospects out to fabulous steak dinners in Las Vegas. And the finance people are like, Dr. No back at headquarters, making things difficult and you end up with finance people that think the sales guys are a bunch of expense account drunken slobs. And the salespeople think the finance people are a bunch of bureaucrats back at home who don't know how things work in the real world and how important relationships are to our business and blah, 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 blah. And I think the great tragedy is that is the norm. At most, especially big companies, you kind of settle into those roles in a way I think is hugely dysfunctional. So to come back to your question, what does it feel like when it's not that? I think it's just there's empathy and understanding in both directions. You have folks in the finance team who have empathy for how hard it is to sell, how important relationships are, what are the key strategies underway, and they look for ways to support and enable those efforts. And similarly, you have salespeople who think like shareholders and who are careful about the way they spend the company's money and who are happy to be, held accountable and held to the discipline of budgets by a set of resources that happen to be back at headquarters.
That's a good point. And I recall you saying, and this is back in the days, I still remember it. You're saying that's a huge difference between CFOs that says no, they had no, and then the CFOs that would find a way to say yes.
That's right.
To be able to bridge the gap. Yeah.
Yeah. No is the easiest word in business. At some point, it's easier to say no. No makes this go away. I got to get back. I'm trying to close the quarter. No is easy, right? And it's particularly easy if you're the guy with the checkbook. What you want, and again, the best people I've worked with, you certainly among them, they'll say, well, I can't do that. Help me understand why you need this. Or they're trying to get underneath, how do we get ourselves on the same side of the table looking at the problem together? And if you can do that, almost in any dimension of business, but particularly in this dynamic between sales and finance, you just can come up with so much better solutions. Now it's you two together against the problem instead of one facing off against the other.
Yeah, and it's one of the attributes of Jim Kay. Actually, I had to bring him off. Yeah, it's probably somewhere. I was like, okay, but yeah, it makes sense, and we see that happening more and more, especially in VC-backed startup. Okay, what would be an effective strategy? One, and then two, what advice would you give CFOs seeking to better align their finance function with GTM objectives?
Great question. I would say, first of all, make an effort to understand what's happening. What is the strategy? Who are these people? Go on a couple of sales calls. I find this is good advice, not only for CFOs, but for CMOs. There are marketing people who don't go on enough sales calls. You have to, what is it? Lou Gerstner said that, a desk is a very dangerous place from which to view the world. I love that quote. And it's so true of people in positions of authority inside startups, or inside, mid-market and enterprise businesses. Like in a startup, everybody's kind of in it, right? You're close enough physically to people who have other functional responsibilities that normally some of the external reality kind of creeps into their understanding. But as a business begins to scale, you increasingly operate within the silo of your own functional expertise. And I think at some point that becomes a real detriment to doing your job effectively in your shared interest as shareholders in the business. And so, it starts with really trying to understand what's happening, really get to know the people. It's hard to get to know someone when you're already at the point where their interest on an individual question is contrary to your own. Like, a sales guy comes in, they want to do an event in Minnesota on Thursday night. You don't have the budget in the field marketing. And once you're at that point, that it's really hard to start a relationship, right?
Right.
What you want is that you've invested in a relationship with people. They know you as an individual. You understand them and what they're about. And if you're able to make those investments up front, then when there is a problem, when I want to run an event in Minnesota and we don't have the money, now it's me going to Cuddy and it's you talking to Mike. It's not a dialogue between sales and finance, right? And most people are reasonable. Look, these sales guys can be, they're hard drivers, but they're the most practical people in the world. They're very clear on what they need to do. They're very pragmatic in that sense. And they like to solve problems. That's their job. And so if you can get to know them as people and not as the abstraction of the quote unquote pushy salesperson, the best salespeople I've known have been great listeners, great problem solvers. And I would say the same is true of the best finance people I've known. They were great listeners. They were focused on how do we solve this problem in a way that everybody wins.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think from a finance perspective, if we can view ourselves as being supporting the sales function in a way, not saying, okay, you can't do this, that kind of thing. I remember many times you just walk by finance, like, Cuddy, get it done.
Yeah. Well, support implies something more hierarchical than I think you intend. You are an enabler. Like, how do we enable people to do that which is in our shared interest, right? Because if a business is very well managed and it's not growing, that's not creating much value for anybody. So to be an enabler, if the answer to this question is no, what is the question I can say yes to? It comes back to, again, one of the things that made Jim Kay and the organizations he ran such a breath of fresh air to work with, because it was like he would really try to understand, why do you want this? And then is there some other way? Like any good negotiator, is there some other way to get you what you really need here in a way that operates within the constraints that we've agreed as executives in this company we need to operate within this quarter? Yeah.
Well put. Obviously, Actifio, you've touched so many people. I mean, the folks that you brought on, many of them, they've gone on to be CMOs, VP marketing, and that says a lot, right? But when we step back a little bit and looking at you, talk to me about the thought that you had in mind that takes you away from marketing, really not away from marketing, but then moving into VC. What did you have in mind, and what brings you to that point to move away from just being a CMO into more of a VC guy?
Yeah. great question. So when I was at Actifio, Andreessen Horowitz was an investor, as you will no doubt recall.
Yep.
And I had a really positive experience out at their executive briefing center in Palo Alto. And I wrote a Medium post about it. I think the headline was, "What's so special about Andreessen Horowitz?" And this thing, for whatever reason, went viral. And the point of the piece was that, all VCs provide cash, all VCs provide contacts, and all VCs provide counsel, meaning advice on whatever you're doing. There had been a wave of VCs who provided content at that time that was sort of somewhat innovative, that you would have these kind of prominent VC bloggers who were sharing ideas all the time about how to build startups more effectively, and that was valuable. And the point of the piece was, I think that the real winners of the next wave, the next tier of value that VC should be providing to their portfolio companies is capability. And that was what made Andreessen Horowitz special, that they not only had content, you could not only go read a blog post about how to run an executive briefing center, but they had a place that they brought portfolio companies and customers together. And it was awesome, like run like a top, like really, incredible. And so it became these 5 C's and blah, blah, blah. I think it was a kind of turning point. It was the central innovation of that fund back in the day. So having written this, I got like a bunch of inbound queries from venture capital firms. And several of them, and I responded like, "Hey, thanks, I'm glad you enjoyed the piece." And chit chat, blah, blah, like meet for a drink, blah, blah, blah. And a couple of these turned into opportunities, meaning they said, "Hey, have you, I remember this went the same way, like, hey, so what do you think about venture capital?" And I was like, to be honest, most venture capital people I've known haven't added a ton of value. I don't have a hugely positive view of the function. But, they were like, "Well, have you ever thought about kind of coming over to the dark side yourself as an investor?" And, I've grown up as a marketing guy. I have my MBA from Harvard, and I get the bigger picture, and had been a CEO a couple of times as well. Actifio happened to be a place where I really decided to kind of double down on the thing that really made me special. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But anyway, I had these opportunities, and it was so far from the way I thought about what I did. And it sounds like when you heard it, you were kind of like, why the hell is Mike, doing that instead of being a marketing guy? And so I reached out to one of the VCs who I thought, did add value, and that was Bob Hauer. Now my partner, he was on the board of Actifio and was really a VC who really understood marketing and someone with whom I built a relationship over the years. And I said, "Hey, listen, I'd like to talk to you about something." He's like, "Great, I got tickets to the Red Sox game. Why don't we go?" So I said, "Sure." So we went to the Sox game and whatever, have a couple of beers, a couple of hot dogs at Fenway. And he's like, "So what's up?" And I said, "Well, I wrote this piece." And he's like, "I read it. I thought it was great." I said, "I've been approached by a couple of VC firms. And me and that job." I'm like, "Do you think I would enjoy that job? Number one. Number two, do you think I'd be any good at it?" And he said, yes, and come be my partner. If you're going to do that, come work with us. Now, I had been a member and a limited partner in that first G20 fund, and certainly loved what they were doing. And a lot of it became a question of like, okay, G20 tends to invest a little bit later stage. For those who don't know G20, we are a Series A fund, and we really focus on, companies that are approaching or at the point of product market fit. So, we say we're the capital partner that helps new businesses grow. By implication, we are not the capital partner that helps new businesses figure out what business they're in. Those are the seed funds. We really are looking for founders who are at the point in their business where they're shifting focus from selling to building a machine that sells. That's really where we like to get involved. And it just seemed to me that was really the point where what I do, which, as you say, is storytelling. I mean, I'm a storyteller. That's really what I am. That was where that created value. Like in the seed stage, you're still feeling around for what it is. And is it useful to be able to articulate your hypothesis of customer value prop effectively? It absolutely is. But you're kind of cycling through those, every week. Whereas when someone gets to the point of raising Series A, they kind of like, okay, here's what it is. And what they need is clarity and communications discipline in articulating that value prop to the world. And knowing how to do that I felt would give me an advantage in pursuing those deals and in adding value to the portfolio that we were able to assemble. And that is really what led me, quote unquote, to the dark side. And the final point I'll say here is just, I grew up in the agency business. Actually, I was, helping to run an agency in Boston when I was recruited by Ash to come to Actifio. And so like I do approach VC almost as a service provider or with a service provider mentality. Like I'm in it to help my clients, quote unquote. Now, these happen to be CEOs who I have some, sway with, but at the end of the day, I think of them as my clients. I'm trying to help them communicate more effectively with the world, help them tell their stories. And that mentality, that posture, like VC doesn't feel like a radically different job. Like, I sometimes describe it as I'm creating value in the way I always have. I'm just capturing some of that value for me in a much better business model than is typical of an advertising agency.
That makes absolutely sense. You have a much more higher bird's view, so to speak. You're not limited to just one company. And then this is something you invest in, and then with your time, and then you see it grow over time. And I totally agree with you, Mike, but it's really not a massive change of career from just being a CMO and going into VC. I think you were ready for it 20 years ago. It just took you this while.
That's very kind of you to say. I learned from the best. I had very good mentors, and I think part of the reason we all have such affection for Actifio is all of us learned so much through that experience, the good and the bad of it. And it's because it was run like a family. There was some effort to kind of understand the cultural default inside that place was, to try to understand where the other person is coming from. Like give this person the benefit of the doubt and listen to them. And I think that subtle thing makes a huge bit of difference. And it did give me a sense of like, okay, I understand customer success. I understand finance. I understand, these other functions that were maybe further afield than where I had spent most of my career. Yeah, it did. It gave me the confidence to do this job.
Great. Let's talk about storytelling. Most of the time it's underappreciated, right? Finance, CFO sometimes need to get away from just the accounting and the bookkeeping, making sure debit and credit balance. But more so, how can CFOs and finance leader leverage storytelling to influence stakeholders, right?
I love this question. So, you can rise up to, pretty high in the finance organization as a manager of numbers. You can reconcile accounts. You can operate in spreadsheets. And there are people who do that very important work. More and more of it will be done by machines. At some level, it is about the management of numbers. But at a certain point in your career, in the career of any finance person who aspires to leadership, it becomes much more about the management of people. Not only people who do that work, but you want to be someone who shapes behavior across the organization. And one of the things that I've always believed as a marketing person is that all the data in the world won't change someone's mind. If you want to change what someone does, you have to change not only what they think, but what they feel. And then the only thing that does that is a story. So the ability to tell stories rooted in financial reality, right? To figure out what stories are important, to figure out what operational reality, what insight about the business is revealed in the quantitative analysis, and make sure that insight reaches the people who are in a position to use it to advance the interests of the business. Like that's the whole game. If all the spreadsheets are accurate, like that makes you a good accountant, but it doesn't make you a good finance leader. Leading in finance is about imparting insight to people who need it to make better decisions. And there's nothing more valuable in doing that than the ability to tell stories. And so I think it's absolutely fundamental to people in that job in order to do what they're tasked with doing.
I totally agree. I've always said that anyone can run a profit and loss, balance sheet, a cash flow statement, right? Anyone can run it. Anyone can just about do debit and credit. But really what sets you apart is the ability to explain what it is. and where you're going, right? It's no different from storytelling.
That's right. That is exactly right. Here's where we are. And, what the essence of a story, like to have a story, like you need a hero and a villain and whatever. And like, in finance, you get to decide like who's the bad guy, Yeah. And maybe the bad guy is overspending. Maybe the bad guy is net revenue retention. Maybe the bad guy is whatever. But we have this shared enemy. And look, let me show you how this is affecting us. Let me show you how this is affecting you as a shareholder in this business. And like, here's how I think we can fix this. Like, that's the whole game.
Branding. What role does effective branding play in helping startups attract investors and talent? And then 2, if you can share a success story, which I think you have many, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So branding I always thought of it as the kind of emotional value proposition that surrounds your product or service. All products and services, after a certain point, have some rational value prop, right? Ideally, some quantitatively rational value prop that is like, here it is. But very often in a category, a lot of the competitors have a similar rational value prop, and the differences are subtle. We live in a world where anybody can make anything.
Right.
That was true of hardware for a long time, and now it's increasingly true of software. And so having these kind of emotional differences used to be something that was really important in consumer products, right? What's the difference between Coke and Pepsi? They're both black sugar water, but Coke is more about the real thing. Coke is real. Pepsi's more about new and exciting. Pepsi's new, Coke is real. Depending on which of those ideas you're more attracted to tends to be which soft drink you drink. So,
I was going to say that, but I digress.
Yes. So coming from that world into the world of enterprise software, the sort of thing that led me to that journey in my own career was the realization that the emotional dimension mattered in enterprise purchase decisions, right? I used to say to the team 5 times a week, companies don't buy things. People inside companies buy things. And those people are shaped by the same emotional drivers, before 5 o'clock as they are after 5 o'clock. And so, the ability to tell stories, to make them, show them how whatever you're trying to sell is going to help them realize whatever their goals are as an individual or as a business. Like that ability to connect to the people is fundamental to success, no matter how technical your value prop is. And by way of example, I always felt like Actifio wasn't really in the data virtualization game. We were in the freedom business. We were able to liberate our customers from the tyranny of 20th century storage architectures, which they had been imprisoned by in the regime that preceded copy data virtualization. And describing it in those terms, really kind of bringing that set of ideas to what had always been a pretty cool technology, just kind of opened people up and helped them understand not only what this is or how it worked, those things come later. They first need to understand why it matters to them. And that value prop for truly great enterprise software always has an emotional dimension for the buyer. And so, branding is really about exploring that emotional layer of value for the customer. And if you don't do that, you're very likely to be beat by someone who does.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thanks again, Mike. I think those are all the questions that I have. This has been great. Just want to recap some of the key takeaways today, one of which was fostering collaboration between finance and go-to-market strategy. And the lesson is that Mike's venture capital journey throughout, and then the power of storytelling. Was there anything else I'm missing?
No, I think that's it. I think just good business is personal. Get to know the people that you enable. Get to know the people. It's not only makes for higher likelihood of business success, it makes for a better life. I'm so glad to see you, my friend. You are just one of the truly special people that I've had the joy of working with over my time. I mean that sincerely. And that's what it's about. At the end of the day, man, this is hard. If you're doing it with people you like and you're trying to make a difference, like make it about the people. And it's not only going to be more successful, you're going to have a lot more fun along the way.
That means a lot, Mike. I understand what relationship is. I've taken that with me since Activio. Even for the client that I support here, I make sure that relationship is important to me. And the practice at Witham, that's the same model that we follow. For those who wants to know a little bit about Witham, back office accounting support and fractional CFO, please go to witham.com/oasis, and that's spelled OASYS. Thank you again, Mike. It was a pleasure to see you. I will definitely keep in touch.
All right. Talk soon.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you'll be first in line to hear what's coming next. Don't want to wait for our next episode? Check us out at witham.com. That's WITHUM.com.